As he finished up his shift, Jackson let out a weary sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. The cleaning cart rattled softly as he pushed it toward the storage closet, his mind already half in bed. It had been a long night, and he was eager to leave the echoing, sterile halls of the office building behind. But as he turned the corner to the coat rack by the entryway, something stopped him in his tracks. A coat, a heavy, thick wool coat, hung sloppily on one of the hooks. It was hard not to notice it. Every inch of the once gray fabric was soaked in dark, almost rust-colored stains. The blotches were uneven, some spreading out like pools, others splattered in tight, violent bursts. At first, he thought it might be a prank. Some of the employees here had a twisted sense of humor. Or maybe someone spilled red paint from the maintenance closet and used the coat to clean up the mess. He stepped closer, squinting under the dim hallway lights. The stains were too thick, too dark to be paint. The smell hit him then, a sharp, metallic scent he recognized all too well. It was unmistakably blood. The realization struck him like a chill up his spine. "Come on, someone's got to be messing with me," he muttered, trying to convince himself. The idea of handling something so grisly didn't sit well with him, but he dealt with plenty of odd cleanups over the years. This one, he told himself, was just another mess. Determined to rid himself of the disturbing sight, he grabbed the coat, its wet weight almost unpleasant in his hands. He bundled it up and stuffed it into a large trash bag, tying it tightly and tossing it into the dumpster out back. As he walked away, he gave one last glance over his shoulder just to make sure it hadn't somehow found its way back out of the bag. It hadn't. Shaking his head, he let out a small, nervous chuckle. This place was getting to him. He locked the door behind him and left for the night. The next evening, Jackson returned to work with the encounter already slipping to the back of his mind. He went about his routine, pushing his cart from one floor to the next, mopping, emptying trash cans, vacuuming the endless maze of carpets. As he came down the stairs, he felt the familiar comfort of wrapping up for the night. But as he neared the coat rack, his stomach twisted. There, hanging in the exact spot where he had seen it last night, was the same coat. Dark stains marred the fabric, dry now, but unmistakably the same shade of dark, dry blood. Jackson's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. "Who's messing with me?" he hissed under his breath, looking around as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the wall. But the hallway was empty, silent in a way that seemed more ominous than usual. He approached the coat warily, reaching out with hesitant fingers. It was as real and as blood-stained as it had been last night. His stomach churned. He thought about the dumpster out back. There was no way anyone could have fished it out and brought it back in, right? And even if they did, why? Trying to shake off the unease, he muttered, "It's just a coincidence, that's all." He didn't quite believe it himself, but he had to move on. With trembling hands, he took it down, turning to throw it out once more. As he walked through the empty halls, the air felt heavier, as if the silence itself was pressing down on him. When he passed an empty meeting room, he could have sworn he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of something dark shifting in the shadows. He stopped, peering into the room. There was nothing there, just rows of empty chairs, a projector, and the eerie glow of a screensaver bouncing around in the darkness. The silence in the building felt thicker, more oppressive than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He shook his head, trying to clear it. The coat was just a prank. And the shadows? Just his imagination. As he tossed the coat in the dumpster for the second time, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The building felt different tonight, less like the place he'd cleaned for years and more like a trap, something alive, something waiting. By the third night, Jackson was barely keeping it together. The coat had appeared once more, draped over the same hook, in exactly the same blood-stained condition he had found it in. No matter what he did, no matter how far he took it, the coat came back. This time, he tried something different. He didn't touch it right away. He just stood there, staring at the dark stains, breathing in the faint, sickly scent of old blood that seemed to drift from it. His hands trembled. His heart raced. He'd cleaned this building for years. He'd seen odd things, plenty of them, but this was different. He felt haunted. Unable to resist, he finally reached out, lifting the collar, pulling the fabric closer to examine it. Each touch left his fingers feeling coated in something cold and sticky, even though the blood had long dried. The fabric was torn in several places, as if whoever had worn it had struggled violently, snagging the coat on something sharp. The edges of each tear were frayed, shredded in a way that made his stomach turn. The stains weren't just random. As he traced his finger along one dark patch, he realized the blood seemed to form a faint, eerie pattern, almost like symbols. They were indistinct, just impressions, but they were there, hidden in the creases of the fabric. "Get a grip, Jackson," he whispered, trying to shake himself out of it. He threw the coat into a trash bag again and took it all the way to the building's incinerator, feeding the bag through the flames and watching until he saw the last scrap of fabric burn to ash. Satisfied, he turned and walked back to the hallway, fighting to steady his breathing. Yet, as he returned to the coat rack at the end of his shift, it was there. Hanging just as he'd left it, the faint odor of blood once again curling in the air. A chill prickled at the back of his neck. That night, sleep was a luxury he didn't get. The coat haunted his dreams, visions of it swaying back and forth on the hook like a pendulum, dripping fresh blood that pooled around his feet. And it was always accompanied by whispers, faint and maddening, circling around him, seeping into his mind. "You can't throw it away," a voice would murmur. "It belongs to you," another would hiss, closer to his ear. By the time Jackson arrived for his shift the next night, he was a wreck. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles. Every shadow in the hallway seemed sharper, deeper. He walked down the hall with a gnawing sense of dread, his palms sweaty as he approached the coat rack. And there it was, waiting for him. Desperation crept in. He shoved the coat into a new bag and took it across town to an old, unused dumpster outside an abandoned warehouse. He dumped it in and slammed the lid shut, as if sealing away a nightmare. But when he returned to the building later, it was there, hanging on that damned hook, taunting him. His heart sank. It wasn't just the coat anymore. There was something else. He started to hear noises in the empty building, faint, creeping whispers that trailed him as he cleaned, as if someone were speaking just behind him, close enough that he could feel their breath on his neck. He'd whip around, expecting to see someone standing there, but each time, the hall would be empty. When he turned the corner to clean the meeting rooms, he thought he saw shadows flickering at the end of the hall. At first, he dismissed it as the building lights flickering, or maybe even a trick of his tired eyes. But as he got closer, he could make out shapes, humanoid shadows that moved with a strange, deliberate grace. The moment he got too close, they would vanish, as if retreating just out of sight. The paranoia grew with each passing night. He could feel something watching him, always just out of reach, lurking in the blind spots. As he cleaned, he found himself glancing over his shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see the coat, or worse, something wearing it, creeping up behind him. The whispers grew louder, more persistent. They were no longer just faint murmurs. Now they felt directed at him, insistent and accusing. When he passed certain rooms, he swore he heard his name hissed in a voice that seemed both human and not. The words burrowed into his mind, their meanings just on the edge of comprehension, slipping away like shadows before he could fully grasp them. "Who are you?" he yelled down an empty hallway one night, his voice echoing in the silence. Only silence replied, heavy and oppressive. Jackson knew he was losing his grip. He couldn't tell anyone about this, not without sounding like he was mad. And yet, each night, the coat waited for him, its tattered fabric now almost a mocking presence, a constant reminder that whatever was haunting him wasn't about to leave. On his fifth night, he decided to throw it far out of the city, a last, desperate attempt to be rid of it. He drove miles outside of town, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears. He found an isolated spot near a riverbank, dug a shallow hole, and buried the coat beneath layers of mud and leaves, covering it with rocks for good measure. He stared down at the small mound, a part of him almost believing it was finally over. But when he returned to work, the coat was waiting for him, untouched, unstained by mud or dirt. Perfectly clean, and yet with those same dark bloodstains. His fingers twitched as he realized he couldn't keep doing this, that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to let him go. His mind began to spiral. Every whisper, every shadow seemed to reinforce the idea that he was losing control, that he was no longer alone in his own head. By the seventh night, Jackson was barely coherent, muttering to himself as he worked, casting frantic, paranoid glances at every shadow and corner. He could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the whispers that seemed to echo in his mind. They were telling him things he didn't want to hear. Dark, violent thoughts slipped into his mind, ideas that felt foreign and yet strangely compelling. He felt himself pulled toward the coat, compelled to touch it, to put it on, as if it were calling to him, drawing him in. When he finally reached out to touch it again, his hand shook, his vision blurring. As his fingers brushed the blood-stained fabric, a surge of emotions flooded him, fear, anger, despair, emotions that felt overwhelming, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. For a fleeting moment, Jackson thought he saw a face in the shadows of the empty hall, watching him, a hand of blood-stained fabric draped over its shoulders. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, feeling that the coat was far more than a piece of clothing. It was a tether, binding him to something dark, something that would keep pulling him back night after night, until there was nothing left of him but a shadow, just like the ones that lingered in the corners, whispering his name. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that the coat was more than just a random piece of clothing. There was a malevolent energy to it, something that crawled under his skin and made him feel as though he were being watched. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he began digging into the building's past, hoping to find anything that might explain the coat's terrifying persistence. The building's records weren't easy to come by. Jackson spent hours at the local archives, poring over old newspaper clippings and dusty documents. Finally, he stumbled upon a small, almost forgotten story buried in the back pages of an article from 20 years ago. Violent incident at office building, suspect never found. His heart raced as he read. According to the report, there had been a horrific event on the very floor he cleaned. A man, rumored to be a disgruntled employee, had reportedly snapped and attacked several of his coworkers late one night. Witnesses claimed he'd been wearing a dark coat, one that eerily resembled the one Jackson kept finding on the coat rack. The police had never apprehended the man, and the story had faded into local legend, eventually forgotten by most, until now. Jackson's hands shook as he absorbed the details. The man had apparently vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a trail of blood and terror. No one knew what had happened to him, but some said they could still hear his footsteps echoing through the hallways late at night. As Jackson read on, a chill settled over him. The timing, the location, everything pointed to the coat being somehow connected to that night. The building, he realized, had a darkness to it, a shadow left over from that incident. It wasn't just his imagination, something was lingering here, and it seemed intent on making its presence known. The more he discovered, the more the coat's appearances escalated. No longer confined to the coat rack, it began turning up in different rooms. He would find it draped over the office chairs, sprawled across tables, or even lying on the floor as if someone had collapsed in a bloody heap. Each night, it seemed to be closer to where he was, following him in a sick, twisted game. One night, he found it in the break room, slung over the back of the very chair where he sat to eat his meals. Another time, it was waiting for him in the janitor's closet, as if daring him to pick it up again. He tried to tell himself it was just a coincidence, but every time he looked at it, he could feel something sinister radiating from the fabric, something cold and unsettling. As the days wore on, Jackson's mind began to unravel. His sleep was plagued with nightmares, hazy images of a dark figure looming in the corridors, shadows flickering at the edge of his vision, whispers that seemed to grow louder the closer he got to the coat. In one nightmare, he found himself wearing the coat, his hands stained red as he stumbled through the building. He could feel a strange, cold satisfaction as he moved, as if he were reliving someone else's actions. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of his own screams still ringing in his ears. During his shifts, the paranoia clawed at him. Every shadow, every flickering light seemed like an omen. He could feel his sanity slipping, his grip on reality loosening with each passing night. The whispers, once faint, were now nearly constant, a soft, insistent murmur that seemed to come from every corner of the building. He could almost make out words in them now, his name, whispered low and slow, as if spoken by someone just out of sight. Jackson, they seemed to say, stretching out the syllables in a mocking, taunting tone. Sometimes, when he passed certain rooms, he would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, quick shadows slipping out of sight before he could focus on them. Once, he thought he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a dark shape wearing a familiar blood-stained coat. But when he blinked, it was gone. Desperation gnawed at him. He needed answers, something to ground him, to convince him he wasn't losing his mind. He spent hours poring over the few details he could find about the incident, obsessing over every rumor and report. The man had been seen arguing with a coworker earlier in the evening, then reportedly snapped, going into a frenzy. Witnesses said he muttered to himself, something about being made to do it, as if he had no choice. The idea chilled Jackson to the core. He began to feel a strange connection to the man, as if he could sense the man's anger, his desperation, his growing paranoia. He wondered if he, too, was being pulled into whatever dark force had haunted that man, as if the coat itself was a vessel for something sinister, something that reached out and twisted the minds of those who came too close. As his paranoia deepened, he felt constantly watched, followed by something that lurked just outside his line of sight. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, convinced that he'd catch a glimpse of someone standing behind him. When he turned on the lights, the shadows seemed to cling to the walls, as if reluctant to disappear. One night, as he was scrubbing a stain from the floor, he heard a faint laugh echo down the empty hallway. It was low, barely audible, yet it seemed to surround him, filling the empty space with a heavy, oppressive presence. Jackson froze, his breath catching in his throat. He strained to listen, but the laugh faded, replaced by a deep silence that felt almost mocking. The coat began appearing not just in different rooms but in stranger places, Once, he found it lying across his cart, the sleeves stretched out like open arms. Another time, it was folded neatly on his chair, as if someone were inviting him to sit down and wrap himself in it. The toll on Jackson's mind was becoming unbearable. He could hardly eat, barely slept. His once tidy appearance deteriorated, dark circles ringing his bloodshot eyes, his clothes disheveled and his hands shaking. He felt like he was losing himself, as if the coat was somehow draining him, pulling him deeper into its dark grip. Finally, in a moment of desperation, he confided in one of his coworkers, a night guard named Tony, someone who had been around almost as long as Jackson. He tried to explain what had been happening, though he could barely put it into words without sounding insane. But Tony just looked at him, his face pale, his eyes dark and shadowed. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Tony asked, his voice a low whisper. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He nodded, feeling both terrified and relieved. Tony sighed, glancing down the hall as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "That coat, you're not the first, Jackson. People have tried to get rid of it, but it always comes back. The man who wore it, they say he was driven mad, just like you're describing. It's as if the coat wants to be found. And those who find it, well, they're never the same." A cold dread settled over Jackson as Tony's words sank in. The coat wasn't just haunted, it was a curse, something dark and twisted that fed on those who encountered it. The idea that he might be just another victim, doomed to fall into madness like the man before him, gnawed at him, sending him spiraling further into despair. The final straw came one night when he returned to the janitor's closet to find the coat draped over his own clothes, its blood-stained fabric blending with his belongings as if marking him as its own. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the coat was absorbing everything, his voice, his sanity, his very sense of self. The whispers grew louder, their words clearer now, filling his mind with dark thoughts, violent urges that weren't his own. He could feel something inside him shifting, a presence worming its way into his thoughts, whispering dark promises and urging him to do unspeakable things. The coat had become more than an object. It was alive, a malignant force that had latched onto him, drawing him into its cursed history, and he knew, deep down, that it would never let him go. The cleaner, Jackson, was unraveling by the day, his desperation tightening around him like a vice. His once rational mind had been stretched thin by the coat's ceaseless appearances and the building's oppressive, shadow-filled silence. No matter how hard he tried to discard it, the coat always returned, as though it had some twisted claim on him. But the possibility that someone could be behind it nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. One evening, after another failed attempt to banish the coat, Jackson snapped. He stormed down the hall, marching straight to the security office. He found Rick, the head guard, sipping coffee and watching the building's monitors, oblivious to the dark weight bearing down on Jackson. "Rick, I need answers," Jackson demanded, his voice a tight whisper that barely held back the edge of hysteria. "Who's messing with me?" Rick looked up, puzzled. "What are you talking about?" Jackson leaned in close, his eyes wild. "The coat. The blood-stained coat. Someone's moving it, placing it where they know I'll find it. Is it you? Or Tony?" Rick's brow furrowed, the confusion shifting to something akin to alarm. "Jackson, I don't know what coat you're talking about, and neither does Tony. Are you feeling all right?" Jackson gritted his teeth, feeling anger simmer below the surface. He stormed off, marching up to the maintenance staff and cornering them one by one, demanding answers. They all shook their heads, each one echoing the same confused denial. He even confronted the building's management, who regarded him with a mix of concern and irritation. That night, feeling helpless and cornered, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He was convinced someone was toying with him, and he would prove it. He returned to the janitor's closet, rummaging through his supplies until he found an old, battered security camera that hadn't been used in years. After tinkering with it, he positioned it carefully to capture the coat rack where he always found the coat hanging. If someone was sneaking in to place it there, he'd finally catch them on tape. Satisfied, he left the camera running and walked away, feeling a brief surge of hope. At least now he might have some evidence, something to hold on to. That night, he went home and tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the coat. It was as if it were stitched into his mind, a dark, bloody stain that wouldn't fade. The following evening, he rushed to check the camera footage, his hands trembling as he hit play. The screen flickered to life, showing an empty hallway. Hours passed in silence, with nothing but the occasional flickering of the hallway lights. Then, as the clock struck 2 a.m., the feed changed. A shadow crept into view, darker than the dim light should have allowed. The coat wasn't there, and then, without warning, it appeared. It didn't enter the frame, wasn't placed on the rack by human hands. It simply materialized, the shadows thickening around it until it took form, its blood-stained fabric unmistakable. Jackson's breath caught as he stared, unable to process what he was seeing. He rewound the footage and watched it again and again until he could no longer deny the truth. No one had placed the coat there. It had simply appeared, almost as if it had been born from the darkness itself. A cold dread settled over him. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a sick joke played by someone with a twisted sense of humor. He was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. For the next few nights, the coat's presence intensified. He would find it in new, disturbing places, sprawled across the floor in the middle of the hallway, draped over his cart, lying on the break room table like a twisted centerpiece. And it wasn't just the coat. The building itself seemed to be turning against him. The lights began flickering whenever he passed, leaving him in sudden pockets of darkness that seemed to stretch far longer than a simple power outage. In the silence of the empty corridors, he could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps trailing him, echoing hollowly against the walls. But every time he turned around, he found nothing but empty space. And then there were the whispers. Low, insistent murmurs that seemed to come from all directions at once, so faint he could barely make out the words. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They spoke his name in tones that dripped with malice, echoing off the walls and filling his mind with an insidious dread. Jackson. He tried to ignore it, but the paranoia clawed at him, growing more unbearable with each passing night. He no longer felt alone in the building. The shadows seemed to close in around him, following his every move, watching him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. One night, as he was finishing up his shift, he heard a voice, a clear, unmistakable voice, whispering his name from down the hall. He froze, his pulse hammering in his chest, and looked down the dim corridor. The shadows were thick, shifting slightly as if alive, and at the far end, he saw it. The coat was there, lying crumpled on the floor, but now, something about it seemed even more sinister. The fabric glistened wetly in the faint light, as though freshly stained. He could smell it from where he stood, a sharp, metallic tang of old blood, cloying and sickening. Driven by a mixture of fear and fury, Jackson approached the coat, fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice a raw whisper. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on him like a weight. And then, in the quiet, he heard a faint, mocking laugh, a sound that sent icy needles down his spine. He backed away, his courage evaporating, and bolted down the hall, stumbling over his own feet in his haste. As he fled, the building seemed to close in around him. The lights flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He could feel the walls pressing closer, the air growing thick and suffocating, as though the building itself were alive, feeding on his terror. He barely made it to the exit, bursting out into the night air, gasping for breath. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He just kept running, desperate to escape the building's oppressive grip. But even outside, he couldn't escape the coat's hold on him. That night, he dreamed of it, dark, flickering images of himself, wearing the coat, his hands stained red. He felt a strange, chilling satisfaction, a hunger for something he couldn't name. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, the echo of that mocking laugh lingering in his mind. Jackson knew he was spiraling. He felt trapped, ensnared in a nightmare that had no end. He considered quitting, but something kept drawing him back, a dark pull he couldn't resist. It was as though the coat had become a part of him, an inescapable shadow that clung to his soul. In a final act of desperation, he returned to the archives, determined to find anything that could help him. He combed through old articles, sifting through rumors and whispered stories of hauntings and disappearances. The violent incident he'd read about hadn't been the only one. There were others, guards who'd gone mad, maintenance workers who'd quit after seeing things in the shadows, rumors of a curse that had haunted the building for years. The coat, he realized, was tied to something far older and darker than he'd imagined. It was a relic of the past, a vessel for a malevolent force that had taken root in the building and fed on those who lingered too long. And he had become its latest victim. Jackson tried to warn others, but no one believed him. They looked at him with pity, as though he were just another ghost of the building, someone who'd lost his mind in the endless, shadow-filled hallways. And perhaps he had. Jackson was on the edge of breaking, clinging to his last shred of sanity as the coat continued its relentless pursuit. Desperation had led him to reach out to his old friend Max, who claimed to have knowledge of the supernatural. Max had grown up in a family with strong beliefs in the paranormal, and he often spoke about encounters with spirits and the rituals his grandmother had taught him to ward off evil. Jackson was skeptical, but he had nothing left to lose. If anyone could help him, it had to be Max. Late one night, after the building had emptied, Jackson met Max in the dimly lit lobby. Max carried a small duffel bag filled with candles, sage bundles, vials of strange-looking liquids, and a worn book of prayers and incantations. He studied Jackson's pale face, the dark circles under his eyes, and the haunted look in his gaze. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Max asked, setting up the candles in a rough circle around the coat, which lay draped across the floor in front of them. "Sometimes, messing with things like this can make them worse." Jackson nodded, his hands trembling as he took a deep breath. "I can't keep going like this, Max. That thing, it's following me, haunting me. I don't know what it is or why it chose me, but it won't stop until something changes." Max didn't press him further. He began the ritual, lighting the candles one by one and muttering incantations in a low, firm voice. The sage smoke filled the air, thick and bitter, coiling around them in gray plumes. The building felt oddly silent, as though it was holding its breath, watching them. Max sprinkled salt in a protective circle around the coat, and he took out a vial of liquid, explaining that it was holy water blessed by his grandmother. As he poured it over the coat, Jackson could hear a faint, hissing sound, as though the fabric were sizzling under the drops. Max continued his chant, his voice steady and commanding. As the ritual reached its peak, a strange feeling washed over Jackson. The oppressive weight he'd grown accustomed to seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of clarity and peace. The coat lay motionless on the ground, looking almost mundane, its blood stains faded to a rusty brown. When the ritual was over, Max extinguished the candles and placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "I think it's done. You should be safe now," he said, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. For the first time in weeks, Jackson dared to hope that the nightmare was over. That night, he went home and managed to sleep through the night without a single dream of the coat or the shadowed figure. He woke up feeling refreshed, a rare smile crossing his face. But the peace didn't last. The next night, Jackson walked into the building, almost daring to believe that things were back to normal. As he made his rounds, he half expected to find the coat waiting for him, but each hallway and room was empty, untouched. The usual eerie silence seemed somehow lighter. Relieved, Jackson finished his shift with a strange sense of calm, feeling as if he'd reclaimed his life. But then, as he made his way back to the janitor's closet to pack up, he froze. There, hanging from the hook by the door, was the coat. But it wasn't the faded, dry blood garment he'd come to dread. It was fresh, vibrant, the bloodstains looking as though they had only just soaked into the fabric, dark and wet. Drops of blood dripped slowly onto the floor, pooling into a small, sticky puddle. The sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood filled the closet, clawing its way into Jackson's nose, his mouth, his lungs. A scream caught in his throat as he stumbled backward, horror twisting his insides. Whatever they had tried to cleanse, whatever they had hoped to banish, hadn't left. Instead, it seemed angrier, more present than ever. Jackson's mind raced. Was this some kind of retaliation? Had the ritual disturbed something far darker than he had anticipated? As he stared at the coat, a shadowy figure began to take shape beside it in the dim light of the closet. It was a man, or what once had been a man. His face was obscured, shrouded in darkness, but Jackson could make out a pair of hollow eyes, empty yet burning with malice. The figure raised a hand, pointing straight at him, and Jackson felt an overwhelming wave of cold sweep through his body, rooting him to the spot. He staggered back, slamming the door shut and running down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silent building. But the figure's presence seemed to follow him, lurking in every shadowed corner, watching him from every darkened window. The lights flickered as he moved, casting fleeting glimpses of his own terrified face in the reflections. In a state of panic, Jackson pulled out his phone and called Max, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. "Max, it's still here," he whispered, glancing around as though the shadows themselves might be listening. "The coat, it's worse now. And I saw something. Someone. It's like he's following me." Max hesitated on the other end, his voice tense. "I don't know what to say, Jackson. That ritual should have worked. But sometimes these things can latch onto a place or a person. If it's stronger now, it might be feeding off you. Your fear." Jackson felt a chill crawl up his spine. His fear. He'd been drowning in it for weeks. Every time he tried to throw the coat away, every time he'd encountered its blood-stained presence, his terror had grown, consuming him bit by bit. "Is there anything else we can do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There might be, but it's dangerous," Max replied. "You'd have to confront it directly. Challenge it. But if it's as powerful as it seems, there's no guarantee you'd make it out." Jackson wasn't sure he could handle a direct confrontation. He was already unraveling, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. Yet, the alternative, living in constant fear, haunted by a malevolent spirit, seemed equally unbearable. That night, as he went through his shift, he felt the building's presence pressing down on him, heavier than ever. Shadows twisted and flickered in empty rooms, forming shapes that seemed to watch him, their outlines hinting at unspeakable horrors. He began catching glimpses of the shadowy figure in reflective surfaces, windows, mirrors, even polished floors. Its eyes, hollow and accusing, bore into him with a hatred he could feel deep in his bones. Desperation gnawed at him, driving him to the brink of madness. He started talking to the empty halls, pleading with the spirit to leave him alone, to tell him what it wanted. But the only answer was the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridors, always just behind him, always out of sight. In a final, desperate act, Jackson returned to the janitor's closet and stood before the coat, his hands trembling. He looked into the fabric, into the dark stains that seemed to shift and writhe like something alive. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice cracking. For a moment, there was only silence. But then, a faint whisper slithered through the air, filling his ears with a voice that was both familiar and alien, a voice that seemed to come from the coat itself. "Join me," it hissed, the words dripping with malice. Jackson stumbled back, clutching his head as visions filled his mind, flashes of blood-soaked floors, of the shadowy figure standing over him, of himself wearing the coat, his hands stained with red. He could feel the spirit's hunger, its desire to consume him, to drag him into the darkness where it dwelt. In that moment, Jackson realized the horrible truth. The coat wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a vessel, a conduit for the spirit to reach him, to wear him down until he was nothing but an empty shell, ready to be filled with the spirit's malice. Terrified, he fled the building, running out into the night without looking back. But even as he escaped, he knew that the coat, and whatever horror it held, would be waiting for him, lurking in the shadows, biding its time. And deep down, he knew that he might never truly be free. Jackson's breaking point came in a violent, desperate wave. He had no more questions, no hesitation, only a singular drive to destroy the coat that had haunted him relentlessly. With shaking hands, he wrapped the coat in thick, black garbage bags and drove out of town, heading for an abandoned quarry far from anyone who might see or hear him. As he arrived, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and stale air. He could feel the weight of the coat through the bag, almost as if it were breathing, alive and aware of what he was about to do. He forced himself to ignore the feeling, dragged the bags out, and piled broken branches, dry leaves, and stones in a crude pyre. His hands trembled as he poured gasoline over the coat, the acrid scent stinging his nose and eyes. Without another thought, he struck a match, tossing it onto the pile. Flames roared to life, engulfing the coat. For a fleeting moment, he felt relief as he watched the dark fabric catch fire, bloodstains simmering and curling away in the heat. But then, the world around him twisted. As the flames consumed the coat, Jackson's vision blurred, and he saw something horrific, a figure standing in the flames, cloaked in smoke and shadow. As his eyes adjusted, the figure's face sharpened into his own reflection. He saw himself wearing the coat, the blood gleaming fresh and dark across his chest and hands. His eyes, wild with rage and terror, looked back at him as his mouth twisted into a manic, blood-curdling grin. The apparition raised its hand, and Jackson realized it was laughing, a deep, sinister sound that felt as though it had crawled out from the depths of his soul. "No," Jackson whispered, stepping back in horror. But he was frozen, rooted in place as the vision intensified. The flames reflected in his eyes, the laughter echoed louder, more vicious, reverberating inside his skull. Suddenly, he was yanked back to reality. The flames were gone, the fire nothing more than a pile of smoldering ashes. The quarry lay silent and empty, but in his hands, he couldn't believe it. The coat was there, intact, soaked with fresh blood. He stumbled backward, feeling as though he'd been struck by a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Every instinct screamed at him to throw it, run, scream, anything to rid himself of it. But he couldn't let go. His fingers were locked in place, clutching the thick, sodden fabric. When he finally made his way back to the building, dazed and exhausted, he reached for the doors to leave, but they wouldn't budge. He jiggled the handle, pushing, pulling, even slamming his body against it. No matter what he tried, the doors wouldn't open. Panic rose in his chest, tightening like a vice. Jackson turned, breath coming in shallow gasps as he looked back at the empty, dimly lit halls. The shadows stretched out, shifting in the corners of his vision. He took a shaky step forward, then another, feeling something stir in the deepest part of his mind, a faint memory, vague but familiar, creeping up like a long-forgotten nightmare. Fragments began to surface, flashes of a night he had tried to erase from his mind. The feeling of the coat on his skin, heavy and soaked. His hands stained, sticky and dark. Footsteps echoing in the hallways, a voice pleading, a scream that had torn through the silence. He stumbled, clutching his head as the memories poured in, jagged and raw. It wasn't just anyone who'd worn the coat, it had been him. He was the one who'd been there that night, during that incident everyone whispered about. The blood, the terror, the coat that seemed to have a life of its own. He had repressed it all, locked it away in the far corners of his mind, convincing himself he was innocent, that he had nothing to do with it. A sickening realization gripped him. This building wasn't haunting him, it was holding him prisoner. The whispers, the shadows, they weren't malevolent spirits after him. They were memories, fragments of his own mind clawing their way back to the surface. As he stood there, piecing it all together, he saw a familiar shadow materialize in the hallway. It was the same figure he'd seen in his vision at the quarry, the twisted reflection of himself, cloaked in the blood-soaked coat. The figure raised its head, and Jackson's own hollow eyes stared back at him with a malice that made his blood run cold. He tried to back away, but the shadow advanced, each step deliberate, filling the hallway with an icy dread. Jackson could feel his heart pounding, his breath shallow and ragged. This shadowy figure, it wasn't just a ghost. It was his past, a part of himself that he had buried and forgotten. In a last, desperate attempt to escape, Jackson ran down the hallway, his footsteps echoing as he fled from his own reflection. Every corner he turned led him back to the same place, back to the hallway where the shadow waited, watching him with that blood-stained grin. The building was twisting around him, trapping him in an endless loop. He was never going to escape. As he ran, the whispers grew louder, taunting him, reminding him of everything he had tried to forget. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to reach for him, their fingers brushing against his skin, cold and accusatory. At last, he found himself in the janitor's closet, his last refuge, his heart racing as he shut the door and sank to the floor. But as he looked up, he saw the coat hanging from the hook, swaying gently as though mocking him. He reached out a trembling hand, unable to resist the pull. The moment he touched it, the memories came flooding back in full force. He remembered the thrill, the anger, the madness that had driven him to wear the coat that night, to let it consume him. He had become something monstrous, something that couldn't be contained by the walls of the building or the confines of his own mind. And now, he was trapped, doomed to relive that night for eternity, haunted by his own ghostly presence. The final, horrific truth settled over him like a shroud. The coat was his curse, a relic of the person he had become, a remnant of his sins, eternally binding him to this place and the memories he could never escape. As the lights flickered one last time, the door to the janitor's closet swung open, and Jackson caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror on the opposite wall. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted in that same eerie grin he'd seen in his visions. With a final, despairing cry, he felt himself dissolve into the shadows, his consciousness fading as he became one with the darkness. The coat hung silently on the hook, its fabric dark and damp, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to find it, to awaken the memories within. Jackson was gone, lost to his own curse, a prisoner of his own making, bound forever to haunt the halls, reliving his sins in an endless, nightmarish loop.